Hi, I'm Ike Ellis, and now we're going to talk about planning for an on-premise SQL Server to migrate to Azure. In the last video, we talked about an introduction to how you would migrate and the different products that you could choose and different options and things to think about. Now we're going to talk about specifically about planning, meaning how do we get all the steps down that we're going to be doing and know how they're going to affect one another, and some things that we should do before we even begin doing one thing of work, right? In the next video, we'll look at pre-migration steps, what work we have to do before we're ready to migrate. And then we'll look at migrating to an IaaS solution like Azure VM, migrating to PaaS like Azure SQL Database, some post-migration steps, and then we'll look at modernizing an application and a call to action. But for now, we're talking solely about how to plan a migration project. So we're going to look at our different migration options. We'll look at things that we should consider and think about before we begin any work. We'll talk about the path to the ultimate goal, which likely is migrating to IaaS first, to the VM first, and PaaS second. We'll look at how we can save some money in licensing and how we can make this process a little more affordable. We'll talk about the importance of a project manager. And finally, we'll get a quick demo about how we use Microsoft Project to do a migration successfully. So first off, we should think about the cloud adoption framework. A lot of my slides, by the way, I'm putting in URLs because I think the material there is important. And I know you've got access to the slides, and I want you to have access to all these URLs so that you can learn and read at your own time. But basically, the cloud adoption framework says that what we need to do is choose how we're going to move a monolith into the cloud. Are we going to rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, or replace? And these have their different benefits. I'll explain them in a slide in just a second. But effectively, what we need to do when we think about our Azure database migration journey is we need to spend a lot of time assessing. We need to be thinking about our current implementation, think about all the moving pieces in our current implementation, and then think about how we can get the optimal use of Azure as we migrate each one of those things into the cloud. So the choices that we make when we migrate, we can rehost. Rehost means a lift and shift, meaning we have a whole bunch of stuff on premise and we move it all into Azure. That's obviously an IaaS solution, right? So we're going to take all of our VMs here and put all those VMs into Azure, right? And that is a perfectly acceptable migration strategy, although it's very expensive and you probably won't get the lift that you were expecting to get, although you are in a good position to continue the work and get more value out of Azure in the future. Refactor means that you might have to rebuild some things first, which is what I think you should do. I think you should always be looking at what you can optimize before you begin the migration, and I'll give you recommendations on how to do that in the next video. Re-architect means that you are going to actually strip the monolith apart and start putting it into the appropriate places like Cosmos DB or Azure SQL Database, and you're going to rip the application apart at the same time. That re-architect can be a little dangerous. Some of those projects don't succeed, and obviously if you're going to re-architect, you're not going to go to IaaS, you're going to go to a PaaS solution. Rebuild means that you are literally going to rebuild the whole thing from the ground up. And that is an expensive solution and it takes many years. So that implies that you have a lot of time, that you can keep everything you have in place, don't touch it, and then rebuild everything almost like you're rewriting the whole thing, and then move that over into some type of PaaS solution. So Azure SQL Database Managed Instance is actually a good solution for a product no matter what you choose to do. If you choose to rehost, you probably want to go to a VM, but for the other three things, refactor, re-architect, or rebuild, you might choose Managed Instance for that. So this slide is not meant for me to teach off of. This is meant to be a reference slide for you, but you need to document and design your Azure management strategy. You need to think about these topics that are on this screen, and you need to write down what your intentions are related to how you're going to manage these resources and how you're going to do things like name them, how you're going to do permissions, how you're going to think about disks and things like that. Now, the reason why we're not going to talk about it in this slide is because this is what the class is about. So we're going to talk about these things individually going forward, maybe not in the detail that you'll see in some of the documentation. So the documentation is tagged here for your benefit. Another thing to think about is your cloud type. Now, I recognize that we've got dozens of students in this class and then maybe many more that watch the videos online later. I don't know a lot about your businesses and your organizations. For instance, you might work for the FBI in the United States, or you might work for MI6 in the UK. If that's the case, you might not be able to use the Azure public cloud, but you can still use Azure. There is an Azure government cloud. For instance, I've done work for the FBI, and we hosted a lot of that data for the application that we worked on in the Azure Government Cloud. The Azure Government Cloud is CJIS compliant, which is the United States Criminal Justice Information Systems compliant, which means that law enforcement is allowed to put data into the Azure Government Cloud. They're allowed, like police and the FBI and the DEA and other US organizations. Now, I'm not familiar with the European Government Cloud because I've never worked in it, but you might look and see what your options are on where you can host things. I also know that some of you work in countries that won't allow you to put data into Azure in the United States. You have to choose a region in Europe or in Asia or where you're operating. So you might want to pay attention to that too. Which data center are you allowed to put data in, and what will you be implementing? You also might choose a hybrid cloud, meaning some of your resources might stay on-premise while other of your resources move over to Azure. And it's important to note what's going to stay and what's going to go, right? So if you're going to make notation like that, you're going to want a thorough documentation of your on-premise architecture. I am always surprised by how many customers I walk into do not have their current products and services well documented. Some don't even have any documentation, which, look, I understand that creating documentation is boring, but it is essential to have a well-documented system before we move anything up to Azure. So we have to bite the bullet and do this documentation. If we don't have good documentation, we need to add this to our project plan. Now, once we have good documentation, we should strongly consider moving our on-premise SQL Server to an Azure VM first. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, well, why would we move to an Azure VM first? Like, we want a PaaS offering because it's hot and sexy, and we can get all this management and everything awesome for us, right? It's gonna be great. So why would we go to a VM first? Well, let's not just dismiss a VM. I mean, we get an awful lot from a VM, right? One, we don't have to buy any new hardware. That's a great benefit. In fact, if we open up a VM, in fact, let me, since I'm going to just do a quick thing on the fly real quick, I'm going to show you Azure real quick. Here I have a VM open for you. And if I go to the overview, you can see like the resource group it's in and the name and IP address that it's in, right? And if I click on the size of the VM here, I can choose to have a bigger VM without actually telling anybody. So if I am in charge of this Azure SQL database, or pardon me, this VM with SQL Server on it, I keep misstating that. Right now I'm using 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM, but I can easily just move it to 8 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, or it can go much, much higher than this, right? I just click that, I click resize, few minutes later, boom, I'm on a new VM. I've got all this new power to use. So getting to a VM and getting out of the hardware business is a super great thing to do, and we shouldn't take it lightly. It gives us a lot of power and versatility in manipulating our VMs and our SQL servers. We don't manage any of the supporting infrastructure. We don't have to worry about a network card going bad or anything like that. We're out of that business. We don't have to worry about some configuration setting being messed up in a VM someplace. We don't have to worry about SANs or the SAN running out of space or acquiring more disk space for the SAN. One of my customers just recently had to expand their SAN. It was $4 million. We don't have to ever have that conversation again. That's fantastic. We can tell Microsoft to automatically upgrade and patch our VM if we want. We can also have them do automatic backups of the VM. We can do all sorts of great things. Now, once you get into an Azure VM, you will have to change some things. So there are some things, there is work to do here, right? You need to configure a new network. So Azure needs to know what private subnet it's going to be using, right? What network range space it's going to be using. You need to install agents. You've got different vCPU types. You need to be concerned with security and authentication. And when you get to the VM and you're fully migrated, you've resolved all of that. You've resolved a great big chunk of work successfully. And let's not take that lightly. So if we go to IaaS first, even though it's not as glamorous, we have figured out network bandwidth. We know how much bandwidth we need in order to be successful. That is a big deal, and it is time consuming, and you will feel accomplished once it's done. And then once everything is up in the high-powered networks of Azure, then we could think about splitting things off. But man, we've resolved an awful lot of work here, right? Now I have a quick note to make. Some of my customers have come to me and said, hey, Ike, we're going to move to Azure, and while we do it, we're also going to upgrade to SQL Server 2019. This is a bad idea. We should not do that. What we should do is either upgrade to 2019 first on-premise and then migrate, or what we should do is, if we're using SQL Server 2012, build SQL Server 2012 in Azure on a VM, and then migrate and then upgrade to 2019 there. But what we should avoid doing is migrating and upgrading all at the same time. Now, I'm not telling you not to do it. You can do it. I'm sure you're going to do it anyway if you want to. But when you introduce too many variables and something fails, you just lose it all, right? So if you get the upgrade done first and now you're stable, look, you got the upgrade done. And there's so many benefits, which I'll get into in the next video, on why you want to get an upgrade done first, because some of those features will really aid us in our migration efforts. And then once the upgrade is done, then migrate, and you've removed some variables, you've got a good rollback path, you're in a good spot, okay? Like I said, what do we learn when we migrate to IaaS first? We've learned networking, security, data migration. We've learned, now look, there's one thing I didn't mention before on the previous slide. When you migrate, you're going to have to change a whole bunch of things. Remember that big grid of things, right? Where we looked at Excel and SSIS and SSRS and all these different apps, right? When you migrate, you're going to have to change the connection strings to a whole lot of things. Now, when you do that, you're going to create a list, right? Here's the full list of everything that changed when we did the migration. That list is going to be so valuable when you go to modernize your application and start splitting things out and putting them in the past services that you want to eventually get to. So when we migrate, we're going to catalog and document everything we had to touch during that process. That will aid us in our future planning. Before you migrate, you should consider licensing. Now, SQL Server licensing can be expensive, and in Azure, it's no different. So you're going to want to keep licensing down. The typical way that Azure bills you is pay as you go. That means if you build something and it's running, Azure bills you for it. It bills you usually in increments of about an hour. Some things can be paused. Like an Azure virtual machine, you can build it, you pay for it. If you don't want to pay anymore, you just click pause. It's still there, available to use, it's just not running. It will bill you storage, which most of the time is not that expensive. So if you want to run it again, you click run, it runs, and it bills you for it again. Now, the money can add up quick, so you'll want to look for ways to save. One way you can save is BYOL, bring your own license. Let's say that you already own a license of Azure SQL data, let's say you own a license of SQL Server 2019. Well, you could bring up a VM and click a box that says, hey, I already have a license of SQL Server 2019. Don't bill me again for it, right? Now you can apply that license into your Azure VM and it will work. Another way that you can keep costs down is by using your hybrid use benefit. This is meant for companies like you that are considering migrating to the cloud. Let's say that you have that big monolith SQL Server and it's all licensed up with SQL Server Enterprise. You can start spinning up Azure SQL databases in Azure, and it doesn't have to be one-to-one. So let's say you have a 32 core on-premise monolith. You could spin up 1 or 2 or 4 core Azure SQL databases, several of them, and each core maps to a core up in Azure. You don't have to double buy it, even if you're using both of them in production. What this says is that you're committed to get rid of the on-premise server and replace it with the Azure server. Once you've migrated over, you still don't pay in Azure. Now that license is now applied to Azure. It can be a significant cost savings by doing this, and I mean significant. So significant that I've seen customers actually acquire on-premise licenses because of the savings they get in Azure. Now, keep in mind that in Azure SQL Database, there are different products, like you can do general purpose or business critical. And so the cores map differently depending on what level that you're using in Azure SQL DB. But other than that, it works great. So again, you might, if you know that you're going to be bringing up a whole bunch of Azure SQL databases or an Azure SQL Database Managed instance, and you're looking at keeping costs down, you might consider acquiring licenses brand new and see what that does to your bottom line. Do your research here. I think you'll be surprised how much money you can save. Another way that you can save money is through something called reserved capacity. So if you know that you're not very elastic in your workload, let's say that you know that you're going to need 32 cores and a whole bunch of memory, and you know you're going to use it for like 3 years, right? You can pay a 3-year contract and save significant amount of money. So if you look at this diagram right here, Microsoft is telling you that with Azure Hybrid benefit, you can save 55% potentially. With reserved instances and Azure Hybrid benefit, you could save 80%. It's a substantial cost reduction. So Microsoft says that they don't lock you into the reservation. So when you make the 3-year reservation, you can exchange or cancel reservations as your needs evolved and just pay the difference. So with no fees and no penalties or anything like that. So this means that you get to kind of move these licenses and these reservations around as you need it, and you just pay for what you commit that you're going to do. I think that's a pretty significant cost savings, and you should definitely look into it. But before you do it, remember to do your planning, right? You need to plan how many cores you're going to use. You need to plan how long you're going to use it for. Do your due diligence, do your work, and then plan for licensing and see what it's all going to cost you. We also have dev and test pricing, which can be a 55% savings. So you're going to have different environments. You're going to have your dev and test and stage and eventually production. As long as there are no production users on it, you don't have to pay for the licenses of SQL Server, which can save you 55% on both your VMs and other services. All you have to do is say, yes, this is a dev and test environment. It's also important to remember that your Visual Studio subscription might come with $150 a month of free Azure. That means that if you have a team of like 100 people and they all have Visual Studio subscriptions, each individual developer gets their own $150 a month. That's an awful lot of money in Azure, believe it or not. You can play with an awful lot of Azure SQL databases, app services, IoT hubs, all kinds of different things, Service Bus, all kinds of different things that you can use and not have to pay for. It's pretty neat. Okay, so I want to show you something that you can use for planning. And you guys probably know this already, but let me just bring this up for you. This is Microsoft Project. And Microsoft Project, I know a lot of people are like a little bit scared of it because it seems like something that project managers use, like some big, highly trained project manager person goes in there and she just knows everything and makes it work magic. But we don't have to be an expert in order to use this to our benefit. So I can't really make a project for you. What I can do is remind you of the elements of your project and what they potentially might be. And I can give you guidance on how long things might take, right? Now, what you do, actually, you know what? It might benefit for you to just see this from the brand new, from the beginning. So I'm going to open up a blank project altogether. Let's bring up a new one. Blank project, okay? All right. Notice this is a brand new project, a Microsoft project. What I did in Notepad is I listed some steps that might have to happen for a successful migration. Now, this is by no means complete because that's not the purpose of this demo. It's just to show you some of these steps. If I copy them right down here in the tasks, I get separate tasks down here in project. Now I can start specifying what I think the duration will be. Like I could say this is 4 weeks, right? I can say security is 3 days, right? I could say configuring this is like 4 days. I can say migrate, this is like 3 days, right? You get the idea. Now there's a whole bunch of tasks that might be only 1 day. So what I can do is just say, okay, that's a day, that's a day, that's a day, that's a day. That's now we're going back into like 3 days. Right, 3 days, and so on. Okay, this is 1 day. This is like 5 days. And then let's move some Azure SQL databases to Azure. Let's do that. That's going to be 10 days. And then this is going to take like 4 weeks again. Okay, you guys get the idea. Now, don't worry about the start and finish, but what you can do is start specifying some of the dependencies here. So for instance, express route, which I'll talk about in the next video, how important it is, we're going to need that before we can do this. We're going to need that before we can migrate. We're going to need that, we don't need it there, but we are going to need it there. We don't need it there. Now, for this, we need to configure our VM. So we're going to say this is 3, right? And then here, we're going to say that's 8, and 8, and 8, and 8, and 8, and then from here 8, and then filtered indexing 8. Okay, you get the idea. What I'm doing is I'm creating dependencies here that show me what changes in my project plan. For instance, this one is going to be 8 for sure, and this one's going to be 17. All right. Now, what that did was it gave me a very clear idea about how long this project is going to take by specifying the task list, specifying the duration, specifying what my dependencies are, right? I can't configure the VM until ExpressRoute is configured. I can tell you that if I start this project on September 27th, I'm not going to finish it until it looks like the end of December, maybe middle of December, December 13th, right? So you saw me do this pretty quickly. You should use project to build your project plan. Even if you don't have a project manager, you should still use project, get your tasks in here. Now, look, another thing that can happen is, I'm not going to be able to start till middle of October. So I'm going to say 10/15. It updates all of my dates for me automatically so that I can see, okay, that's going to start 10/15, that will start 10/15, that will start 10/15, right? Now I can see what that does to my end date. And you can see, it pushed my end date to, unfortunately it didn't change the dates the way I thought they should. I don't know, maybe yeah, these I need to update. But anyway, you get the idea. So that's project. That gives you a brief introduction of project. And it's worth learning and it's worth using in a project as complicated with as many dependencies as this project's going to have for you. All right. My last suggestion is to get your own Tim. So this guy's picture, this is a guy that works for Soliance. His name is Tim Henning, and he is an amazing project manager. He does a great job of communicating. And in this project, you're going to need to either hire a Tim or harness Tim, because here's what Tim does very well. Tim communicates to everybody about where the project's going, what's blocking it, what needs to go next, and what is dependent on it. And when I mean everybody, I mean everybody. Everyone knows the status of the project thanks to Tim. And when you're talking about coordinating with Excel models and finance and the report authors with Power BI and with all the app developers and with all the vendors who are running ETL and all the things that are going to need to change when you move to Azure, potentially, you're going to need somebody doing a lot of communication for you. And Tim does that for our projects, and he does a damn good job of it. So you might need a Tim. Another thing I like about Tim that makes him unique is Tim is a great developer and a great data professional. So he can get in there and do work for you. So what on our projects, when we have a lot of moving pieces and there's a blocker, Tim doesn't just complain about the blocker. Tim rolls up his sleeves and dives in there and unblocks the team. And that is super beneficial, and it makes me very, very grateful that he's around. There's one final thing to note in your preparation, and that is some of you might be on SQL Server 2008, and you know it's at end of life. But Microsoft has said that if you migrate your SQL Server 2008 into an Azure VM, they will extend your support. And here's the URL for that. So migrating to Azure is an excellent way to get a little bit more support while you prepare to migrate off of it or upgrade it or move it over to a PaaS offering, right? So you should know that that's there, and you should take that into account in your planning. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks a lot, and we'll take a look at the next video in just a minute.